The winter of 1942 stretched across the Eastern Front like a frozen tomb. In the German trenches near Stalingrad, soldiers huddled around flickering fires, their breath forming clouds in the bitter air. The war had been good to them, too good, perhaps. Paris had fallen, Warsaw lay in ruins, and the Wehrmacht's advance into Russia had seemed unstoppable. Tonight, like so many nights before, they shared jokes and stories to keep the darkness at bay. "Did you hear about the little witches?" Schmidt laughed, warming his hands over the dying embers. The other soldiers leaned in, eager for any distraction from the cold that gnawed at their bones. "The Russians are so desperate. They're sending grandmothers to fight us, flying around in crop dusters like they're going to spray us with fertilizer." Laughter rippled through the trench. The very idea seemed absurd. Women in combat, piloting ancient biplanes against the might of the Luftwaffe. It was the kind of desperate foolishness they'd come to expect from the Soviets. "Nachwechseln," someone called out, coining a term that would soon lose all humor. Night witches. The name rolled off their tongues like a children's fairy tale, but fairy tales, as these men would soon discover, sometimes come true in the most terrifying ways. The wind carried more than snow that night. Somewhere above the clouds, engines hummed, not the powerful roar of German fighters, but something softer, more ominous. A sound like canvas wings cutting through frozen air. The laughter in the trenches began to fade as soldiers cocked their heads, listening to something they couldn't quite identify. Then came the silence. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, when even the wind seems to hold its breath. For a moment that stretched like eternity, nothing moved on the steppe. Then the first explosion lit the horizon, followed by another and another. Supply trucks erupted in flames. Ammunition depots detonated in chains of thunder that shook the earth. By the time the soldiers scrambled from their trenches, scanning the dark sky with wild eyes, there was nothing to see. Only smoke and fire and the fading whisper of wings disappearing into the night. The laughter had died completely now, replaced by something the German war machine hadn't felt in months. Genuine fear. They didn't know it yet, but they had just encountered the most feared pilots on the Eastern Front. Women who flew without parachutes or radios, navigating by moonlight and instinct alone. Warriors who had turned obsolete training planes into instruments of psychological terror. The Night Witches had arrived, and their legend was written in fire across the Russian sky. What the Germans couldn't understand, what perhaps no one could understand who hadn't lived through those desperate days, was how these women had come to be here at all. Their story began not in the cockpit of a warplane, but in the corridors of the Kremlin, where a desperate leader was about to make the most radical military decision of the 20th century. December 7th, 1941, the same day Pearl Harbor burned. Another kind of desperation gripped the Soviet Union. German panzers sat just 18 miles from Moscow's Red Square. The Wehrmacht had carved through Russian defenses like a scythe through wheat, leaving behind a trail of burning cities and scattered armies. In the Kremlin's war room, Stalin faced the unthinkable, the possible fall of the Soviet state. The Red Army was bleeding to death. Millions of soldiers had been killed or captured in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. Tank divisions that had looked impressive on paper had melted away under the German advance. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies, raining death on anything that moved during daylight hours. Traditional military thinking had failed catastrophic Allied. It was in this moment of supreme crisis that an extraordinary woman stepped forward with an extraordinary proposal. Marina Raskova, already famous as the Soviet Union's Amelia Earhart, requested an audience with the Soviet leadership. At 30 years old, she had already set multiple aviation records and captured the imagination of young women across the country. But now she wanted to do something unprecedented in military history. "Give me permission to form all-women aviation regiments," she told Stalin's deputy, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "Let us fight." The idea was radical beyond comprehension. No nation had ever fielded all-female combat aviation units. Military doctrine across the world assumed women lacked the physical strength, emotional stability, and tactical thinking necessary for aerial combat. Even in the Soviet Union, with its stated commitment to gender equality, women pilots were curiosities, not warriors. But desperate times demanded desperate measures. On October 8, 1941, Stalin signed Order No. 0099, authorizing the formation of 3 all-women aviation regiments: the 586th Fighter Regiment, the 587th Bomber Regiment, and the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. It was a decision born not of progressive thinking, but of sheer necessity. The motherland was dying, and every able-bodied male or female was needed for its defense. Word spread quickly through universities, flying clubs, and technical schools. Young women who had dreamed of aviation suddenly found themselves with an unprecedented opportunity. They came from every corner of the Soviet Union: factory workers from Leningrad, students from Moscow, farm girls from Ukraine. Some were barely 18, others seasoned pilots in their 30s. What united them was not just their love of flying, but their determination to defend their homeland. Katya Ryabova was 22 when she heard the call. A geography student at Moscow University, she had learned to fly at a local aero club, never imagining that her weekend hobby would become a weapon of war. "We didn't think about being heroes," she would later recall. "We just knew our country was in danger, and we wanted to help." Nina Respapova was even younger, just 19 when she abandoned her studies at the Moscow Aviation Institute. She had grown up in a family of aviators. Her father, a flying instructor who had taught her to read wind patterns before she could properly read books. For her and hundreds like her, the decision to volunteer was immediate and unquestioning. They gathered at Engels Flying School, south of Saratov. In the bitter winter of 1941, snow swirled around the airfield as the first recruits arrived, young women carrying suitcases and dreams, stepping off trains into a world that would transform them from students and workers into legends. Marina Raskova waited for them, her keen eyes assessing each volunteer with the intensity of someone who understood that these women would either save their country or die trying. The transformation began immediately. Hair was cut short, not as a fashion statement, but because long braids could catch fire in a burning cockpit. Civilian clothes were exchanged for military uniforms, often ill-fitting and designed for men. The women learned to march in formation, to salute with precision, to strip and reassemble aircraft engines with the efficiency of seasoned mechanics. But most importantly, they learned to fly as warriors rather than sportswomen. The leisurely flights over peaceful countryside that had defined their civilian aviation experience were replaced by combat maneuvers, night navigation, and tactics designed to maximize psychological terror while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. They practiced flying in complete darkness, using only the faint glow of instrument dials and the distant glimmer of stars to guide them. The Soviet Union had made a desperate gamble, betting that courage and determination could overcome conventional military wisdom. As 1941 turned to 1942, these young women prepared to prove whether that gamble would pay off. They had volunteered to fight for their motherland, but they were about to become something far more powerful, a legend that would haunt German soldiers. Dreams for the rest of the war. The night witches were about to be born, and the Eastern Front would never be the same. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment assembled at Engels Flying School like a collection of unlikely heroines from different fairy tales. Yevdokia Bershanskaya, who would command them, was a 30-year-old pilot with the calm demeanor of a mathematics professor and the steely resolve of a veteran warrior. Under her leadership, the regiment began to take shape, not through inspiring speeches or dramatic ceremonies, but through the grinding reality of military training. In the depths of a Russian winter, their aircraft were a joke that wasn't funny. The Polikarpov Po-2 was a biplane designed for training student pilots and crop, dusting a wood and canvas relic from aviation's pioneering days. With an open cockpit, no armor plating, and a maximum speed of barely 90 miles per hour, it was spectacularly unsuited for combat. German fighters could fly 3 times faster, A single bullet could turn the Po-2's fabric wings into flaming tissue paper. "We're supposed to fight the Luftwaffe in these?" whispered Nadezhda Popova, staring at the ancient biplane that would become her war machine. At 19, she had expected to pilot something sleek and modern, not what looked like a museum piece held together with wire and wishful thinking. But Bershinskaya saw possibilities where others saw limitations. The Po-2's very weaknesses could become strengths in the right hands. Its slow speed meant it could loiter over targets, selecting the perfect moment to strike. Its wooden construction made it nearly invisible to radar. Most importantly, its tiny engine was so quiet that German sentries often couldn't hear it approaching until bombs were already falling. Training was brutal in ways the women hadn't anticipated. Not just the physical demands learning to fly in sub-zero temperatures while wearing bulky winter gear, but the psychological challenge of being taken seriously by an air force that viewed them as an experiment at best, a publicity stunt at worst. Male instructors tested them with assignments designed to break their spirits. Ground crews forgot to fuel their planes or deliberately damaged equipment to see how they would respond. The women of the 588th responded by becoming better than anyone expected. They memorized technical manuals with the dedication of scholars. They practiced emergency procedures until they could execute them instinctively in complete darkness. When male pilots mocked their sewing circle approach to war, the women quietly outperformed them in navigation tests and tactical exercises. Irina Sabrova, a former chemistry student from Moscow, discovered she had an intuitive understanding of ballistics that made her bombing runs devastatingly accurate. Luba Vinogradova, who had studied music before the war, found that her ear for rhythm helped her identify aircraft engines by sound, a skill that would prove crucial during night missions when visual identification was impossible. They learned to survive on 3 hours of sleep, grabbing catnaps between missions, while mechanics patched bullet holes in their wings. They learned to calculate fuel consumption in their heads while dodging anti-aircraft fire. Most importantly, they learned to trust each other completely, because in the darkness over enemy territory, your navigator wasn't just your partner. She was the difference between life and death. The regiment's first combat assignment came in May 1942, when they were deployed to the southern front near the Don River. German forces were advancing toward Stalingrad, and every available aircraft was needed to slow their progress. The Night Witches would fly their first mission, not against some distant, abstract enemy, but against the very Wehrmacht divisions that threatened to cut the Soviet Union in half. As they prepared for combat, the women of the 588th had no idea they were about to develop tactics that would rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. Their desperate innovations, born from inferior equipment and impossible odds, would create a form of psychological warfare more effective than anything in the German playbook. The ancient biplanes lined up on the runway, like toys preparing for battle against giants. But toys, in the right hands and under cover of darkness, were about to prove more dangerous than anyone imagined. The transformation from students and workers to warriors was complete. Now came the test that would either validate their training or destroy them completely. As the sun set over the Russian steppe, the Night Witches prepared to take their legend into the sky for the first time. The Germans were waiting, confident in their superiority. They had no idea what was coming for them in the dark. The first mission began like a whisper in the darkness. May 23, 1942, a moonless night over the Don River Valley, where German forces had established what they believed were secure supply lines. The Wehrmacht had grown comfortable with their control of the skies. During daylight hours, Messerschmitt fighters ruled the air. At night, they assumed no sane pilot would attempt to navigate the treacherous terrain without proper instruments or radio guidance. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Nadezhda Popova climbed into her Po-2, her navigator Galina Brock settling into the rear cockpit with charts spread across her lap. The open cockpit exposed them to the brutal wind, but it also allowed them to hear every sound, the subtle change in engine rhythm that indicated mechanical trouble. the whistle of wind through wing struts that told them their airspeed, and most importantly, the distant sounds of enemy activity below. "Ready?" Popova called back to her navigator. "Ready," came the reply, barely audible over the engine's puttering. They had no radio, no way to communicate with base once they left the ground. They would fly by intuition and skill alone, navigating by compass and landmarks that were often invisible in the darkness. The Po-2 lifted off with the labored effort of an aircraft never designed for what it was about to do. At barely 500 feet above the ground, low enough that anti-aircraft guns couldn't track them effectively, they began their approach to the target area. Intelligence had identified a German supply depot about 30 miles behind enemy lines. Fuel trucks, ammunition, and replacement parts for panzer divisions heading towards Stalingrad. As they flew deeper into enemy territory, Popova developed a tactic that would make the Night Witches legendary. About 3 miles from the target, she cut the engine. The sudden silence was startling. No mechanical noise, just the whisper of wind through canvas wings. The Po-2 became a glider, nearly silent, drifting toward its target like a ghost. Below them, German sentries heard nothing unusual. The night was full of sounds weighing through trees. The distant rumble of trucks, the normal noise of a military encampment settling in for sleep. What they didn't hear was the soft rustle of fabric wings passing overhead. Popova and Brock glided over the supply depot, studying the layout in the faint starlight. Fuel trucks were parked in neat rows. Ammunition was stacked under camouflage netting. Guards walked predictable patterns, their cigarettes glowing like tiny beacons in the darkness, dot at the perfect moment when the glider was positioned directly over the largest concentration of supplies. Brock released the bombs. 2 50-kilogram explosives dropped silently through the night air. Only when they detonated did the Germans realize they were under attack. The fuel trucks erupted in a chain reaction of explosions that lit the sky like daylight. Ammunition began cooking off in sympathetic detonations that sent shrapnel whistling through the night air. Guards ran in all directions, shouting orders that no one could hear over the thunder of destruction. But by then, Popova had restarted her engine and was climbing away into the darkness. The entire attack had taken less than 5 minutes from engine cutoff to escape. To the Germans below, it seemed impossible, as if the bombs had fallen from nowhere, dropped by invisible spirits that vanished as quickly as they had appeared. "Witches," one German soldier muttered, staring at the burning wreckage. "It's like they're witches." The tactic was so effective that it became standard procedure for the 588th Regiment. Approach silently, strike precisely, disappear completely. The women refined the technique with each mission, learning to judge wind patterns that would carry them to the target, calculating glide paths that maximized their chances of escape, developing an almost supernatural ability to navigate in complete darkness. But the missions extracted a terrible price. Flying at low altitude made them vulnerable to small arms fire from the ground. The Po-2's fabric construction meant that even a lucky rifle shot could cause catastrophic damage. And flying without parachutes, the planes were too small and flew too low for parachutes to be effective, meant that any serious damage was likely to be fatal. Luba Vinogradova learned this lesson during her 3rd mission, when ground fire punctured her fuel tank. She had 2 choices: attempt a forced landing in enemy territory, where capture meant certain execution, or try to nurse the damaged aircraft back to Soviet lines. She chose to fly, the wind-driven fuel spray from her punctured tank creating a fine mist that turned her cockpit into a potential fireball. She made it back by minutes, landing just as the engine seized from fuel starvation. By the end of their first month of combat operations, the Night Witches had flown over 200 sorties, destroying dozens of supply convoys, ammunition depots, and communication centers. More importantly, they had begun to achieve something that conventional bombing raids couldn't accomplish. They were terrorizing the German army. Soldiers who had conquered most of Europe now lay awake at night, listening for the sound of engines that might or might not be there. Supply convoys refused to move after dark. officers who had never shown fear in daylight. Battles found themselves jumping at shadows when the sun went down. The women of the 588th didn't know it yet, but they had stumbled onto something more powerful than any conventional weapon. They had discovered how to turn darkness itself into an ally, and silence into a form of terror that would haunt their enemies for the rest of the war. As summer arrived and the German advance towards Stalingrad intensified, the Night Witches prepared to escalate their campaign. They had proven their worth in individual missions. Now they were about to show what sustained psychological warfare could accomplish when conducted by women who had learned to make the impossible look routine. By midsummer 1942, the whispers had begun. German soldiers no longer joked about little witches flying crop dusters. Instead, they huddled in their bunkers after sunset, smoking cigarettes with shaking hands and listening to sounds that might or might not be there. The Night Witches had evolved from a curiosity into a nightmare that haunted the dreams of men who had conquered half the world. Nachwechseln, the term had lost all humor. German field reports now used it officially, acknowledging that these women pilots had become a legitimate tactical threat. Wehrmacht intelligence officers struggled to understand how such primitive aircraft could cause such disproportionate psychological damage to veteran troops who had survived the battles of France and Poland. Training was brutal in ways the women hadn't anticipated. Not just the physical demands learning to fly in sub-zero temperatures while wearing bulky winter gear, but the psychological challenge of being taken seriously by an air force that viewed them as an experiment at best, a publicity stunt at worst. Male instructors tested them with assignments designed to break their spirits. Ground crews forgot to fuel their planes or deliberately damaged equipment to see how they would respond. The women of the 588th responded by becoming better than anyone expected. They memorized technical manuals with the dedication of scholars. They practiced emergency procedures until they could execute them instinctively in complete darkness. When male pilots mocked their sewing circle approach to war, the women quietly outperformed them in navigation tests and tactical exercises. Irina Sabrova, a former chemistry student from Moscow, discovered she had an intuitive understanding of ballistics that made her bombing runs devastatingly accurate. Luba Vinogradova, who had studied music before the war, found that her ear for rhythm helped her identify aircraft engines by sound, a skill that would prove crucial during night missions when visual identification was impossible. They learned to survive on 3 hours of sleep, grabbing catnaps between missions, while mechanics patched bullet holes in their wings. They learned to calculate fuel consumption in their heads while dodging anti-aircraft fire. Most importantly, they learned to trust each other completely, because in the darkness over enemy territory, your navigator wasn't just your partner. She was the difference between life and death. The regiment's first combat assignment came in May 1942, when they were deployed to the southern front near the Don River. German forces were advancing toward Stalingrad, and every available aircraft was needed to slow their progress. The Night Witches would fly their first mission, not against some distant, abstract enemy, but against the very Wehrmacht divisions that threatened to cut the Soviet Union in half. As they prepared for combat, the women of the 588th had no idea they were about to develop tactics that would rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. Their desperate innovations, born from inferior equipment and impossible odds, would create a form of psychological warfare more effective than anything in the German playbook. The ancient biplanes lined up on the runway, like toys preparing for battle against giants. But toys, in the right hands and under cover of darkness, were about to prove more dangerous than anyone imagined. The transformation from students and workers to warriors was complete. Now came the test that would either validate their training or destroy them completely. As the sun set over the Russian steppe, the Night Witches prepared to take their legend into the sky for the first time. The Germans were waiting, confident in their superiority. They had no idea what was coming for them in the dark. The first mission began like a whisper in the darkness. May 23, 1942, a moonless night over the Don River Valley, where German forces had established what they believed were secure supply lines. The Wehrmacht had grown comfortable with their control of the skies. During daylight hours, Messerschmitt fighters ruled the air. At night, they assumed no sane pilot would attempt to navigate the treacherous terrain without proper instruments or radio guidance. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Nadezhda Popova climbed into her Potu, her navigator Galina Brock settling into the rear cockpit with charts spread across her lap. The open cockpit exposed them to the brutal wind, but it also allowed them to hear every sound, the subtle change in engine rhythm that indicated mechanical trouble, the whistle of wind through wing struts that told them their airspeed, and most importantly, the distant sounds of enemy activity below. "Ready?" Popova called back to her navigator. "Ready," came the reply, barely audible over the engine's puttering. They had no radio, no way to communicate with base once they left the ground. They would fly by intuition and skill alone, navigating by compass and landmarks that were often invisible in the darkness. The Po-2 lifted off with the labored effort of an aircraft never designed for what it was about to do. At barely 500 feet above the ground low enough that anti-aircraft guns couldn't track them effectively, they began their approach to the target area. Intelligence had identified a German supply depot about 30 miles behind enemy lines. Fuel trucks, ammunition, and replacement parts for panzer divisions heading towards Stalingrad as they flew deeper into enemy territory. Popova developed a tactic that would make the Night Witches legendary. About 3 miles from the target, she cut the engine. The sudden silence was startling, no mechanical noise, just the whisper of wind through canvas wings. The Po-2 became a glider, nearly silent, drifting toward its target like a ghost. Below them, German sentries heard nothing unusual. The night was full of sounds weighing through trees, the distant rumble of trucks, the normal noise of a military encampment settling in for sleep. What they didn't hear was the soft rustle of fabric wings passing overhead. Popova and Brock glided over the supply depot, studying the layout in the faint starlight. Fuel trucks were parked in neat rows. Ammunition was stacked under camouflage netting. Guards walked predictable patterns, their cigarettes glowing like tiny beacons in the darkness, dot at the perfect moment when the glider was positioned directly over the largest concentration of supplies. Brock released the bombs. 2 50-kilogram explosives dropped silently through the night air. Only when they detonated did the Germans realize they were under attack. The fuel trucks erupted in a chain reaction of explosions that lit the sky like daylight. Ammunition began cooking off in sympathetic detonations that sent shrapnel whistling through the night air. Guards ran in all directions, shouting orders that no one could hear over the thunder of destruction. But by then, Popova had restarted her engine and was climbing away into the darkness. The entire attack had taken less than 5 minutes from engine cutoff to escape. To the Germans below, it seemed impossible, as if the bombs had fallen from nowhere, dropped by invisible spirits that vanished as quickly as they had appeared. "Witches," one German soldier muttered, staring at the burning wreckage. "It's like they're witches." The tactic was so effective that it became standard procedure for the 588th Regiment. Approach silently, strike precisely, disappear completely. The women refined the technique with each mission, learning to judge wind patterns that would carry them to the target, calculating glide paths that maximized their chances of escape, developing an almost supernatural ability to navigate in complete darkness. But the missions extracted a terrible price. Flying at low altitude made them vulnerable to small arms fire from the ground. The Po-2's fabric construction meant that even a lucky rifle shot could cause catastrophic damage. And flying without parachutes, the planes were too small and flew too low for parachutes to be effective, meant that any serious damage was likely to be fatal. Luba Vinogradova learned this lesson during her 3rd mission, when ground fire punctured her fuel tank. She had 2 choices: attempt a forced landing in enemy territory, where capture meant certain execution, or try to nurse the damaged aircraft back to Soviet lines. She chose to fly. the wind-driven fuel spray from her punctured tank creating a fine mist that turned her cockpit into a potential fireball. She made it back by minutes, landing just as the engine seized from fuel starvation. By the end of their first month of combat operations, the Night Witches had flown over 200 sorties, destroying dozens of supply convoys, ammunition depots, and communication centers. More importantly, they had begun to achieve something that conventional bombing raids couldn't accomplish. They were terrorizing the German army. Soldiers who had conquered most of Europe now lay awake at night, listening for the sound of engines that might or might not be there. Supply convoys refused to move after dark. Officers who had never shown fear in daylight. Battles found themselves jumping at shadows when the sun went down. The women of the 588th didn't know it yet, but they had stumbled onto something more powerful than any conventional weapon. They had discovered how to turn darkness itself into an ally, and silence into a form of terror that would haunt their enemies for the rest of the war. As summer arrived and the German advance towards Stalingrad intensified, the Night Witches prepared to escalate their campaign. They had proven their worth in individual missions. Now they were about to show what sustained psychological warfare could accomplish when conducted by women who had learned to make the impossible look routine. By midsummer 1942, the whispers had begun. German soldiers no longer joked about little witches flying crop dusters. Instead, they huddled in their bunkers after sunset, smoking cigarettes with shaking hands and listening to sounds that might or might not be there. The Night Witches had evolved from a curiosity into a nightmare that haunted the dreams of men who had conquered half the world. Nachwechseln, the term had lost all humor. German field reports now used it officially, acknowledging that these women pilots had become a legitimate tactical threat. Wehrmacht intelligence officers struggled to understand how such primitive aircraft could cause such disproportionate psychological damage to veteran troops who had survived the battles of France and Poland. The answer lay not in the technology, but in the tactics the women had perfected through desperate innovation. Each night brought new variations on their theme of terror. Sometimes they would cut their engines and glide silently over German positions without dropping any bombs at night. All psychological raids designed purely to deny enemy soldiers sleep. Other nights, they would arrive in waves, one Po-2 after another appearing out of the darkness to deliver precise strikes on targets that intelligence had assumed were perfectly hidden. Obergefreiter Klaus Müller, a veteran of the Wehrmacht's 6th Army advancing on Stalingrad, wrote to his wife in August 1942, "We call them Nachwechseln, and the name fits. They come at night like ghosts, and you never know if tonight will be the night your number comes up." The worst part isn't the bombs. It's the waiting, listening to every sound in the darkness, wondering if that rustling in the trees is wind or wings. The German military tried everything to counter the Night Witches. Anti-aircraft guns were repositioned to cover likely approach routes, but the Po-2 South flew too low and too quietly for effective targeting. Searchlights swept the sky, but their beams only destroyed the night vision of the operators without illuminating targets that could avoid the light, simply by flying around it. Fighter patrols were organized, but no self-respecting Messerschmitt pilot wanted to risk a night intercept against an aircraft that flew slower than their stalling speed. In desperation, some German units began using vintage biplanes of their own captured Soviet aircraft or ancient trainers, pulled out of flight schools, hoping to fight the Night Witches with their own tactics. But these efforts failed miserably. The German pilots, trained for daylight combat in high-performance aircraft, couldn't adapt to the intuitive navigation and improvised tactics that the Soviet women had developed through months of combat experience. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate areas where the Night Witches operated. Stories spread through the German army like a virus. Soldiers who had never encountered the 588th Regiment still went to bed each night, wondering if they would hear the whisper of canvas wings. Supply officers demanded additional guards for convoys that were traveling hundreds of miles from known Night Witch operating areas. Even Luftwaffe pilots, masters of the European skies, found themselves looking over their shoulders when flying night missions. By September 1942, Heinrich Himmler himself had issued orders regarding the capture of night witch pilots. Any woman taken prisoner who was suspected of belonging to the 588th Regiment was to be shot immediately. No interrogation, no intelligence gathering, just summary execution. The order was both a recognition of their effectiveness and a confession that the German military had no conventional response to unconventional warfare conducted by women who refused to follow the flimsy established rules of combat. The women of the 588th wore this fear like a badge of honor. They painted kill marks on their aircraft, not enemy planes shot down, but successful missions completed. They gave their Po-2 South names like Night Fury and Silent Death, transforming agricultural equipment into instruments of psychological warfare. Most importantly, they began to believe their own legend, developing the kind of confidence that made impossible missions seem routine. Nadezhda Popova, by now a veteran of dozens of combat sorties, had developed an almost supernatural ability to find targets in complete darkness. She could identify German positions by the smell of their cigarettes, navigate by the sound of different engines, and judge her aircraft's altitude by the feel of air pressure against her face. What had begun as desperate improvisation had evolved into skills that seemed to transcend normal human capability. But the price of legend was written in blood and exhaustion. The Night Witches flew multiple missions each night, sometimes up to 15 sorties between sunset and dawn. They survived on catnaps, snatched between flights, eating cold rations while mechanics patched bullet holes in their wings. Their aircraft bore scars from countless encounters with ground fire, and every woman in the regiment had experienced at least one forced landing behind enemy lines. The fear flowed both ways. German soldiers feared the Night Witches, but the women of the 588th feared capture even more than death. They knew what Himmler's orders meant. They knew that falling into German hands would result not just in execution, but in torture designed to extract information about Soviet aviation capabilities. They flew without parachutes, not just because their aircraft couldn't accommodate them, but because they preferred the certainty of death in a crash to the uncertainty of what would happen if they were taken alive. As 1942 drew to a close and the battle for Stalingrad reached its climax, the Night Witches had achieved something unprecedented in military history. They had transformed themselves from a desperate experiment into a weapon of terror that the German army genuinely feared. The laughter that had greeted their formation had been replaced by genuine respect from their own forces and terrified whispers from their enemies. But legends, as these women were learning, come with a cost that can never be fully calculated until the bills come due. The Night Witches had proven they could make grown men afraid of the dark. Now they would discover what it meant to live with that fear themselves, night after night, mission after mission, until the war finally ended or claimed them all. Between the terror and the legend lay the grinding reality of survival. In barns that served as barracks, in mechanics' tents lit by kerosene lamps, in the brief moments of quiet before the next mission, the Night Witches lived lives that balanced extraordinary courage with ordinary human needs. They were warriors who darned socks, heroes who wrote love letters, legends who worried about their families back home. The accommodations were Spartan at best. The 588th Regiment moved constantly as the front lines shifted, setting up temporary bases in abandoned collective farms, forest clearings, or any flat stretch of ground long enough for a Po-2 to take off and land. Home was often a barn shared with 20 other women, sleeping on straw mattresses with their flight gear serving as pillows. Privacy was a luxury that didn't exist. Galina Brock, who served as navigator for several pilots throughout the war, later described the routine. We would land from our last mission around 4 in the morning, stumble to our bunks for maybe 3 hours of sleep, then start preparing for the next night's operations. There was always something: engines to tune, canvas to patch, bombs to load. We lived in a perpetual state of exhaustion, that somehow became normal. The aircraft maintenance was a constant battle against time and scarcity. The Po-2 South were never designed for the punishment they received in combat operations. Canvas wings torn by shrapnel were patched with whatever fabric could be found, sometimes parachute silk, sometimes pieces cut from spare uniforms. Engine parts wore out faster than they could be replaced, forcing mechanics to cannibalize damaged aircraft to keep others flying. Nina Raspopova became expert at emergency repairs, learning to fix a damaged aileron with wire and canvas while other crews prepared for their missions. "We treated our planes like wounded soldiers," she remembered. "You did whatever it took to get them back in the air, because every aircraft grounded meant one less sortie against the Germans." Food was another constant concern. Official rations were often delayed or diverted to frontline infantry units. The women of the 588th survived on black bread, tea that was more water than leaves, and whatever vegetables they could forage or trade from local farmers. Occasionally, a successful mission would be rewarded with a bottle of vodka shared among the entire crew. But such luxuries were rare. Yet somehow, in the midst of exhaustion and deprivation, the women maintained their humanity. Letters home were precious, read and reread until the paper fell apart. Photographs of families were treasured possessions, carefully protected from the elements and carried on every mission. Some women kept diaries, documenting not just their combat experiences, but their thoughts about the war, their fears for the future, and their memories of peacetime. Katya Ryabova wrote to her mother in November 1942, "Don't worry about me. Mama, we are keeping busy here, and the work is important. I can't tell you much about what we do, but know that we are making a difference. I think of home every day, especially when I see the sunrise after a long night. I dream of sitting in our kitchen again, drinking real tea and listening to you worry about normal things." The bonds between the women grew stronger than family ties. Navigator and pilot partnerships were especially intense. These women trusted each other with their lives every night, navigating by whispered communications and hand signals in darkness so complete that they couldn't see each other's faces. They learned to read each other's moods, to communicate complex information with a touch on the shoulder or a shift in breathing pattern. When death came, as it inevitably did, the grieving was private but profound. The Soviet military machine had no time for extended mourning rituals, but the women of the 588th created their own ceremonies. They would gather around a photograph of the fallen comrade, sharing memories and making quiet promises to honor their sacrifice. Personal effects were carefully packed and sent home with letters that tried to explain the unexplainable, how someone so young and full of life could simply vanish into the darkness. Romance existed, but it was complicated by the realities of war. Some women formed relationships with male pilots from other regiments, stolen moments of tenderness between combat missions. Others found love with ground crew members or intelligence officers. But every relationship existed under the shadow of mortality, with the understanding that tomorrow might bring separation or loss. Yevdokia Bershinskaya, their commander, maintained morale through a combination of maternal care and military discipline. She insisted on proper uniforms and military courtesy, but she also made sure that every woman under her command knew she was valued as an individual. She wrote personal letters to the families of women killed in action, visited the wounded in field hospitals, and somehow managed to remember the birthday of every pilot and navigator in the regiment. She was like a mother to us, Nadezhda Popova recalled decades later. She never asked us to do anything she wouldn't do herself, and she never forgot that we were women as well as warriors. In a world that had gone mad, she kept us sane. The small rituals became important. Sharing a cigarette before a mission, checking each other's equipment with the thoroughness of a mother preparing her child for school, painting tiny stars on aircraft noses to mark successful sorties, singing folk songs during maintenance work, voices harmonizing in the darkness, while hands worked by feel to repair bullet holes and worn cables. These moments of normalcy provided the psychological foundation that made their extraordinary courage possible. The Night Witches weren't fearless. They were women who had learned to function despite fear, to maintain their humanity while doing inhuman work, to find strength in each other when individual strength wasn't enough. As 1943 dawned and the war entered its most brutal phase, the women of the 588th Regiment had created something unique in military history, a combat unit that combined lethal effectiveness with deep emotional bonds, professional excellence with personal loyalty, legendary status with fundamental human decency. They had learned to live between the darkness and the dawn, finding light in friendship and purpose in shared sacrifice. But the war was far from over, and the Night Witches' greatest challenges still lay ahead. The German army was about to discover that making enemies of these remarkable women had been the worst mistake they could possibly make. By the spring of 1943, the Night Witches had evolved from experimental unit to strategic weapon. What began as a desperate improvisation had become a systematic campaign of precision terror that was reshaping the psychology of the Eastern Front. The women of the 588th Regiment now flew with the confidence of veterans, their primitive biplanes transformed into instruments of warfare so effective that German commanders were forced to alter their operational planning around the threat they represented. The transformation was visible in every aspect of their operations. The hesitant student pilots of 1942 had become aerial predators who could navigate in absolute darkness, identify targets by sound and smell, and deliver bombs with surgical precision. Their aircraft, once dismissed as museum pieces, now bore the scars and kill markings of weapons that had proven themselves in the crucible of combat. Nadezhda Popova had become something approaching a legend within the regiment. With over 800 combat sorties to her credit, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to find and destroy high-value targets. German intelligence had put a bounty on her specifically, recognizing that she represented not just tactical skill, but the embodiment of something they couldn't understand or counter. She could find a needle in a haystack at midnight, her navigator, Galina Brock, once said. I've seen her locate a camouflaged ammunition dump that our intelligence people swore didn't exist, guide us through anti-aircraft fire that should have killed us both, and put a bomb within 3 meters of where it needed to be. And she did it while flying a training plane held together with wire and hope. The regiment's operational tempo had intensified beyond what anyone thought humanly possible. On peak nights, veteran crews flew up to 15 sorties between sunset and dawn, taking off, bombing a target, returning to rearm and refuel, then immediately launching again. The women survived on catnaps between missions, wolfing down cold rations while mechanics patched their aircraft and loaded fresh bombs. The targets had evolved as well. No longer content with supply convoys and ammunition dumps, the Night Witches now struck at the nerve centers of German operations. Command posts, communication centers, airfields, and fuel depots. Anything that could disrupt the Wehrmacht's ability to coordinate and sustain its forces. Each successful mission forced German commanders to dedicate more resources to rear area security, troops and equipment that couldn't be used for frontline operations. But perhaps most importantly, the Night Witches had become masters of psychological warfare. They understood that their greatest weapon wasn't the 50-kilogram bombs they carried, but the fear they generated in enemy minds. They began varying their tactics deliberately, sometimes bombing with devastating effectiveness, other times flying harassment missions designed purely to deny German troops sleep and peace of mind. Luba Vinogradova perfected the art of the ghost run, approaching German positions with engines cut, gliding silently overhead without dropping any bombs at all, then disappearing into the darkness. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers would lie awake all night, knowing that Soviet bombers had been directly overhead, wondering why no bombs had fallen, and when the attack would finally come. The German response grew increasingly desperate and increasingly brutal. Anti-aircraft guns were repositioned nightly in attempts to counter the Night Witches' unpredictable approach routes. Entire infantry companies were pulled from frontline duty to provide security for supply lines that had previously been considered safe. Most tellingly, German units began refusing to move at night unless they had fighter cover, luxury the Luftwaffe could rarely provide. Heinrich Hoffmann, a Wehrmacht officer captured during the Soviet counteroffensive at Kursk, provided insight into the German perspective during his interrogation. The Nachwachsen were worse than your artillery, worse than your tanks. We could prepare for those, dig in, find cover. But the witches, they could be anywhere, anytime. A man couldn't close his eyes without wondering if he would wake up to explosions. They turned night into a time of terror. The women themselves had changed as profoundly as their tactics. The eager volunteers of 1941 had been replaced by hardened veterans who understood war's true cost. They had lost friends, survived crashes, been shot down behind enemy lines, and walked back to Soviet territory through forests filled with German patrols. They had learned to kill with efficiency and to grieve quickly, because tomorrow night would bring new missions and new dangers. Irina Sabrova, now a senior pilot with hundreds of combat hours, described the psychological transformation. We stopped being girls pretending to be warriors and became warriors who happened to be women. The distinction matters. We knew our business, we trusted our skills, and we stopped apologizing for being effective. The Germans had taught us that there was no mercy in war, so we stopped offering any. The Soviet High Command began to take notice. Generals who had initially viewed the all-women aviation regiments as publicity stunts now competed to have night witch squadrons assigned to their sectors. Combat reports documented the disproportionate impact of the 588th Regiment compared to conventional bomber units flying more advanced aircraft. The women were achieving strategic results with tactical resources, disrupting German operations far out of proportion to their numerical strength. Recognition came in the form of honors and decorations, but also in the form of respect from male Soviet pilots who had initially dismissed them. Fighter pilots who encountered night witches returning from missions began offering escort protection without being asked. Ground crews from other units volunteered to help maintain the Po-2 South during particularly intense operational periods. The women had proven themselves not just to their enemies, but to their own comrades. Asterisk. Yet success carried its own burden. The more effective the night witches became, the more desperately the Germans tried to counter them. Bounties were placed on individual pilots. Special hunter-killer teams were organized, with the sole mission of shooting down Po-2 South. Captured Soviet aviators reported that German interrogators were particularly interested in information about night witch tactics and operational procedures. As the tide of war began to turn and Soviet forces prepared for the massive offensives that would eventually carry them to Berlin, the night witches prepared for their greatest challenges. They had proven that courage and innovation could overcome technological disadvantage. Now, they would discover whether those same qualities could sustain them through the final, most brutal phase of the war. The darkness had been their ally, but dawn was coming to the Eastern Front. When it arrived, the night witches would either be remembered as heroes who helped win the war, or as warriors who died trying. Either way, their legend was already written in fire across the Russian sky. The spring of 1944 brought a fundamental shift to the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht, once an unstoppable force advancing deep into Soviet territory, was now in full retreat. From Leningrad to the Black Sea, German armies fought desperately to maintain defensive lines that crumbled faster than they could be reinforced. And above them, night after night, the sound of canvas wings whispered death from the darkness. The night witches flew in advance of every major Soviet offensive. Their missions now integrated into comprehensive battle plans developed by the Red Army's most senior commanders. They had evolved from a desperate experiment into an essential component of Soviet military strategy. Their psychological impact as valuable as their tactical effectiveness. The retreat changed everything about aerial warfare on the Eastern Front. German forces, no longer able to establish secure rear areas, found themselves vulnerable to attack at every point along extended supply lines. The Night Witches exploited this vulnerability with devastating efficiency, striking at bridges, fuel depots, communication centers, and troop concentrations with a precision that seemed impossible given their primitive equipment. Katya Ryabova, now a veteran of over 400 combat sorties, led a mission in June 1944 that exemplified how completely the tactical situation had reversed. Intelligence had identified a German armored division attempting to establish defensive positions along the Dnieper River. The division's fuel supplies were concentrated in a forest clearing, camouflaged and guarded, but still vulnerable to attack from aircraft that could approach undetected. The mission required everything the Night Witches had learned about: precision bombing and psychological warfare. Ryabova's flight of 6 Po2 South approached the target in complete darkness, navigating by compass and landmark while maintaining radio silence. 3 miles from the target, all 6 aircraft cut their engines simultaneously, gliding silently toward the forest clearing where German fuel trucks waited. The attack was perfectly coordinated. 6 sets of bombs fell within seconds of each other, igniting fuel supplies that had been intended to sustain German defensive operations for weeks. The resulting fireball could be seen for miles, a pillar of flame that announced to German and Soviet forces alike that the Night Witches had struck again. But more than fuel had been destroyed. The psychological impact on German troops who witnessed the attack. Fuel supplies that had seemed perfectly safe suddenly erupting in flames. Aircraft that appeared from nowhere and vanished just as quickly was devastating. Units that had been prepared to fight effectively during daylight operations became demoralized and ineffective, constantly looking over their shoulders and jumping at every sound after sunset. The pace of operations had become relentless. As Soviet forces advanced westward, the Night Witches moved with them, establishing new bases every few days and immediately resuming combat operations. They flew in all weather, in conditions that would have grounded more conventional aircraft. Rain, snow, fog, nothing stopped the Po2 South from taking to the sky. When targets were available, the aircraft themselves had evolved as well. Mechanics had learned to modify the basic Po2 design, adding improvised armor around vital components, improving bomb racks for more efficient loading, and even installing primitive radio equipment in some aircraft. The planes that had started the war as training aircraft now bore only superficial resemblance to their original specifications. Nadezhda Popova's aircraft, which she had named Night Fury, was a perfect example of this evolution. The original canvas had been patched so many times with different materials that it resembled a patchwork quilt. The engine had been rebuilt 3 times using parts cannibalized from other. Po2 South, the cockpit contained navigation equipment scrounged from shot down German aircraft and bomb sites, improvised from rifle scopes and mathematical instruments. Yet somehow, this mechanical Frankenstein flew mission after mission with reliability that amazed even its pilot. She wasn't pretty, Popova later recalled, but she was faithful. In 3 years of combat, she never failed to bring me home. I trusted her more than I trusted some people. The women themselves had been transformed by their experiences. The eager volunteers of 1941 had become hardened combat veterans whose skills rivaled any pilots in the world. They could navigate by stars, identify aircraft by engine sound, judge wind speed by the feel of air against their faces, and deliver bombs with accuracy that defied the limitations of their equipment. More importantly, they had developed an institutional knowledge that made the entire regiment more than the sum of its parts. Veteran pilots taught newcomers not just how to fly combat missions, but how to survive them. Navigation techniques, evasion tactics, target identification methods, all the deadly skills that couldn't be learned in flight school were passed down through informal mentorship programs that operated alongside official military training. Yevdokia Burshinskaya, still commanding the regiment after 3 years of combat, had become one of the most respected officers in Soviet aviation. Her tactical innovations were studied and copied by conventional bomber units. Her leadership techniques were used as models for training other commanders. Most importantly, her ability to maintain unit cohesion and morale under impossible conditions had become legendary throughout the Red Army. But the cost was becoming visible in ways that military decorations couldn't address. Many of the women showed signs of combat fatigue that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress. Sleep deprivation had become chronic. Some pilots hadn't had a full night's rest in months. The constant danger, the loss of friends, the psychological pressure of night after night of combat operations had taken a toll that would only become fully apparent years after the war ended. Yet they continued to fly. As Soviet forces approached the borders of Poland and East Prussia, the Night Witches prepared for operations in territory they had never seen, against German forces fighting with the desperation of men defending their homeland. The war was entering its final phase, but the most dangerous mission still lay ahead. The darkness that had been their ally was about to become a battleground where legends would either be confirmed or die trying. The Night Witches had come too far to stop now. But the price of victory was about to test everything they had learned about courage, skill, and survival. The winter of 1944 brought the Night Witches to the gates of the Reich itself. As Soviet forces crossed into East Prussia and approached the Oder River, the women of the 588th Regiment found themselves operating over German soil for the first time. The psychological impact of this reversal was profound. They were no longer defending their homeland but carrying the war into the heart of enemy territory. The missions had taken on a different character. Where once they had struck at German forces occupying Soviet land, now they bombed German cities, industrial centers, and infrastructure targets that had never known the sound of Soviet aircraft. The Po-2 South, designed for crop dusting and flight training, were now delivering death to the factories and rail yards that had supplied the Wehrmacht's war machine. Irina Sabrova led a mission in January 1945 that would become emblematic of this new phase of operations. The target was a rail junction in East Prussia, where German forces were attempting to coordinate the evacuation of civilians and military equipment ahead of advancing Soviet armies. The mission required precision bombing in heavily defended airspace, with the added psychological pressure of operating deep in enemy territory. The flight of 8 Po-2 South approached the target through weather that should have grounded any aircraft. Snow squalls reduced visibility to mere yards, while winds gusted strong enough to flip a lightweight biplane. But the Night Witches had learned to use weather as camouflage, flying when conventional wisdom said it was impossible. Sabrova's navigation was flawless despite the conditions, using dead reckoning and an intuitive understanding of wind patterns developed through hundreds of combat missions. She guided her formation directly to the rail junction. The attack was devastating. Trains, loaded with military equipment, erupted in explosions that could be heard for miles, while the rail lines themselves were torn apart by perfectly placed bombs. But the mission's true significance lay in what it represented. German forces that had once seemed invincible were now cowering in bunkers, while Soviet women flew ancient biplanes over their homeland with impunity. The reversal was complete, and everyone involved understood its symbolic importance. The pace of operations had reached levels that defied human endurance. Some Night Witch pilots were flying 20 sorties per night during critical offensive operations, landing only long enough to refuel and rearm before taking off again. They survived on Benzedrine tablets and willpower, pushing their bodies and aircraft beyond reasonable limits because the strategic situation demanded it. The aircraft maintenance had become a miracle of improvisation and determination. Mechanics worked around the clock, often by candlelight or flashlight, keeping planes airworthy with spare parts that existed only in their imagination. Engines were rebuilt using components from captured German aircraft. Control cables were replaced with salvaged steel wire. Canvas patches were sewn from parachute silk and tent material. Nina Respopova's mechanic, Senior Sergeant Anya Moratova, had become legendary for her ability to keep aircraft flying under impossible conditions. She could rebuild a Po-2 engine using tools that belonged in a bicycle repair shop, patch bullet holes with materials scrounged from abandoned buildings, and somehow make an aircraft that should have been written off weeks earlier perform like it had just rolled out of the factory. Anya could make a broken clock fly if you gave her enough wire and canvas. Raspopova remembered. She kept us in the air when we should have been walking, and she never complained about impossible deadlines or missing parts. She just made things work. The women had developed a form of camaraderie that transcended normal military relationships. They were sisters, mothers, daughters, and comrades all at once, bound together by shared experiences that no one outside the regiment could fully understand. They had learned to grieve quickly and love deeply, to trust completely and fight without mercy. Letters home had taken on a different tone as well. Where once they had written about training exercises and the excitement of learning to fly military aircraft, now they wrote with the wisdom of veterans who had seen too much death and survived too many impossible missions. Their families back home could read between the lines, understanding that their daughters, wives, and sisters had been transformed by experiences that could never be fully explained. Galina Brock wrote to her mother in February 1945, "We are getting close to the end now. Mama, I can feel it in the way the Germans fight, not with the confidence they had before, but with desperation. They know they are losing, and that makes them more dangerous than ever. But we have come too far to stop now. We will see this through to the end, whatever that costs." The Red Army High Command had begun planning for the final assault on Berlin, and the Night Witches were integral to those plans. Their ability to operate in conditions that grounded conventional aircraft, to deliver precision strikes against heavily defended targets, and to maintain operational tempo despite impossible odds, made them indispensable for the urban warfare that lay ahead. But the approaching end of the war brought its own psychological challenges. Women who had defined themselves entirely through their military service began to wonder what would happen when the fighting stopped. Would they be allowed to continue flying? Would the Soviet Union have any use for Night Witches in peacetime? Would they be able to readjust to civilian life after years of combat operations? These questions remained unanswered as the regiment prepared for its final missions. Berlin lay ahead, protected by the desperate remnants of German forces that would fight with the fury of men defending their capital. The Night Witches had proven themselves against professional soldiers, occupation forces, and retreating armies. Now, they would face fanatical defenders fighting on their home ground with nothing left to lose. The darkness that had been their ally throughout the war was about to become the stage for their ultimate test. In the ruins of the Third Reich, above the rubble of Hitler's capital, the Night Witches would either confirm their legend or die in its creation. Either way, they had already proven that courage, innovation, and determination could overcome any technological disadvantage. The final act of their story was about to begin, and the whole world would watch to see how it ended. May 2nd, 1945. The guns had fallen silent across Europe, but for the Night Witches, the war's end brought not celebration, but a profound emptiness that none of them had anticipated. The women who had terrorized the Wehrmacht for 3.5 years suddenly found themselves without purpose. Their deadly skills no longer needed in a world struggling to remember how to live in peace. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment assembled for the last time on a muddy airfield outside Berlin. Their Po-2 South, scarred veterans of over 30,000 combat sorties, sat in ragged rows like exhausted soldiers waiting for dismissal. The aircraft that had once been dismissed as obsolete training planes were now battle-proven weapons that had helped bring down the Third Reich. Yevdokia Boshinskaya stood before her regiment. These remarkable women, who had followed her through the darkness of the most brutal war in human history. Many faces were missing friends and comrades whose aircraft had never returned from missions over enemy territory. Those who remained bore the invisible scars of veterans who had seen too much and survived against impossible odds. "You have served with honor," Bershanskaya told them, her voice carrying the weight of 3 years of shared sacrifice. You have proven that courage has no gender, that determination can overcome any obstacle, and that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when their cause is just. The world may forget what you have done, but history will remember. The statistics were staggering, though they could never capture the full measure of what these women had accomplished. 30,000 combat sorties flown, 23,000 tons of bombs dropped, countless German supply convoys destroyed, ammunition depots obliterated, communication centers silenced. But perhaps most importantly, they had created a form of psychological warfare that had terrorized one of history's most professional armies. The transition to peacetime proved more difficult than combat had been. The Soviet Union, exhausted by war and focused on reconstruction, had little use for women pilots who specialized in night bombing with obsolete aircraft. Many of the night witches found themselves assigned to civilian aviation roles, crop dusting, mail delivery, flight instruction work that seemed almost insulting after their wartime achievements. Nadezhda Popova, the legendary pilot with over 800 combat missions, was assigned to fly mail routes between provincial cities. The woman who had once struck fear into German hearts now delivered letters and packages to collective farms. It was like being a racehorse hitched to a plow, she later reflected. Necessary work, but not what we were built for. Others left aviation entirely, returning to interrupted educations or taking jobs in factories and offices, where their wartime service was rarely discussed and less frequently understood. The Soviet Union of the late 1940s had little space for female heroes, whose accomplishments challenged traditional gender roles. The night witches had been useful during the emergency of war, but peacetime required different kinds of courage. The official recognition came slowly and incompletely. Some of the women received the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal, the nation's highest decoration. Others were awarded lesser honors that seemed inadequate given their contributions. Many received no recognition at all, their service disappearing into the bureaucratic maze of a military establishment that preferred to remember male heroes. But perhaps the cruelest fate was the silence that surrounded their achievements. Soviet propaganda had celebrated the night witches during the war, using their story to demonstrate the heroism of ordinary citizens defending their homeland. After the war, however, their story was quietly shelved, deemed incompatible with the patriarchal narrative that Stalin's Soviet Union preferred to promote. The aircraft themselves met ignominious ends. Po-2 South that had survived hundreds of combat missions were scrapped for spare parts or abandoned in remote airfields where they slowly rotted away. A few were preserved in museums, but most simply disappeared, their wooden frames and canvas wings returning to the earth. They had once soared above. The women remained in contact with each other, maintaining friendships forged in the crucible of combat. They gathered annually on Victory Day, sharing memories that grew more precious as time passed and the world increasingly forgot what they had accomplished. They were sisters bound by experiences that no one else could fully understand. Galina Brock, who had navigated through hundreds of night missions, became a mathematics teacher in a small Ukrainian city. Her students never knew that their gentle instructor had once guided bombers through German anti-aircraft fire with nothing but a compass and intuition. "I love teaching," she said years later, "but sometimes I would look up at the stars and remember when they were my roadmap to war." The German veterans who had fought against them remembered more clearly. In memoirs and interviews, Wehrmacht soldiers continued to speak of the Nachwachsen with a mixture of respect and residual fear. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, what these women had accomplished in their ancient biplanes. Klaus Müller, the German officer who had written fearfully about the night witches to his wife, survived the war and eventually became a commercial pilot. In a 1975 interview, he reflected on his wartime experiences. "People ask me about the worst part of the war, and they expect me to talk about tank battles or artillery bombardments. But I tell them it was the nights when we waited for the Nachwachsen. They turned darkness itself into a weapon, and that is something you never forget." As the decades passed, historians began to rediscover the story of the night witches. Western scholars, initially skeptical of Soviet wartime propaganda, gradually verified the extraordinary facts of their service. The women who had been forgotten by their own country found themselves celebrated internationally as pioneers of women's military service and examples of human courage under impossible odds. But for the Night Witches themselves, the recognition came too late for many and too little for all. They had lived through one of history's greatest conflicts, had proven themselves equal to any challenge, and had helped defend their homeland when it faced extinction. Then they had returned to ordinary lives in a world that preferred to forget their extraordinary service. In the end, their greatest victory was not the military objectives they had accomplished or the enemies they had defeated. It was the simple fact that they had existed at all, that in humanity's darkest hour, a group of young women had stepped forward to prove that courage, determination, and innovation could overcome any obstacle. They had refused to accept limitations others tried to impose on them, and in doing so, they had expanded the definition of what was possible. The Night Witches had come home from war, but war would never completely leave them. In their dreams, they still flew through the darkness, navigating by stars toward targets that existed only in memory. They had learned to make the impossible look routine, and that lesson would sustain them through the long peace that followed their brief, brilliant moment of legend. Decades later, as the Soviet Union itself became history, the sound of wings in the darkness took on new meaning. The Night Witches had flown into legend, not despite their humble aircraft and impossible odds, but because of them. They had proven that extraordinary courage requires no special equipment, no advanced technology, no perfect conditions, only the determination to act when action is needed most. In nursing homes and retirement communities across the former Soviet Union, the last surviving Night Witches gathered each Victory Day to remember friends who had died in war and peace. Their hands, once steady enough to guide bombs through anti-aircraft fire, now shook with age. Their eyes, which had once pierced absolute darkness to find hidden targets, now struggled with the mundane challenges of reading newspapers and recognizing faces. But when they spoke of their wartime service, something magical happened. The frail elderly women disappeared, replaced by the young warriors they had been 6 decades earlier. Their voices grew strong, their memories crystalline, their pride undimmed by the passage of time. They remembered not just the fear and exhaustion, but the absolute certainty that they were fighting for something worth any sacrifice. Nadezhda Popova, the legendary pilot who had terrified German soldiers across the Eastern Front, lived to be 91 years old. In her final interviews, she spoke not of the medal she had won or the targets she had destroyed, but of the bond she had formed with women who had shared her impossible journey through the darkness of war. "People ask me if I was afraid," she said, her voice still carrying echoes of the strength that had sustained her through 800 combat missions. Of course I was afraid. We were all afraid, but fear was just another obstacle to overcome, like weather or mechanical problems or enemy fire. You acknowledge it, you work around it, and you complete your mission. That's what we did, night after night, until the war was over. The world had changed beyond recognition since the Night Witches first took to the sky in their antiquated biplanes. Technology had advanced to the point where a single modern aircraft carried more computing power than had existed in all of 1942. Wars were now fought with precision missiles guided by satellites, stealth fighters invisible to radar, and drones controlled from thousands of miles away. Yet the fundamental truth the Night Witches had discovered remained unchanged: that human courage, properly applied, could overcome any technological disadvantage. They had proven that innovation born from desperation could be more effective than resources born from abundance. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, were capable of achievements that redefined the possible. Their legacy lived on in the women who followed them into combat aviation, in the military doctrines that incorporated their tactical innovations, and in the expanded understanding of what women could accomplish when given the opportunity to prove themselves. The glass ceiling they had shattered in the skies over the eastern front could never be fully repaired. But perhaps their most important legacy was intangible. The simple knowledge that when civilization itself was threatened, a group of young women had refused to accept that there was nothing they could do to help. They had volunteered for a mission that seemed impossible, had learned skills that seemed beyond human capability, and had persevered through conditions that should have broken anyone's spirit. In the end, the Night Witches had proven that legends are not born from perfection, but from the determination to act despite imperfection. They had taken obsolete aircraft and inadequate resources and transformed them into instruments of strategic impact. They had accepted fear as a constant companion and functioned effectively despite it. They had faced an enemy that considered them subhuman and forced that enemy to respect their capabilities. The sound of their wings in the darkness had faded into history, but the echo remained. Somewhere in the night sky, beyond the reach of radar and satellite surveillance, the memory of their courage continued to whisper to anyone willing to listen. It spoke of possibilities that conventional wisdom deemed impossible, of strength that came not from advanced technology, but from advanced determination, of victory achieved not through overwhelming force, but through overwhelming will. The Night Witches had come home from war, but they had left behind something imperishable proof that in humanity's darkest hours, ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things. Their story had begun with laughter from enemies who underestimated what women could achieve. It ended with the eternal silence of those enemies and the eternal gratitude of a world. They helped save in the darkness that exists in every generation. When civilization faces threats that seem insurmountable and traditional solutions prove inadequate, the memory of the Night Witches continues to offer hope. They remind us that courage has no gender, that innovation can overcome any obstacle, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes prove to be the most effective ones. The laughter had died long ago, but the legend lived on. And in a world that still faces darkness, that legend continues to matter.